Morning, church. It is good to be alive. It's good to be here. And it's good not to be redundant. I had a friend who used to say that a lot. I'm glad I'm not redundant. And I just had to scratch my head. What are you talking about? Until it dawned on me. God has made every one of us unique. God has made every one of us different than the other for a good reason, for a good purpose. Because if we were all the same, we would be redundant. There would be no need for most of us. Matter of fact, if we were all the same, there'd be no need for any of us except one. I don't know which one that would be, but we'd all be the same. I'm glad not to be redundant. God has made us with gifts. He's made us with talents. He's made us with personalities. He's made us different. It's a beautiful mosaic that God puts together to make his church, to make his world. Thank you for being a part of it today. It's been a good weekend so far. We had a great gathering with the men yesterday for prayer breakfast. Breakfast was good. Prayer was good. Sean Bates came and spoke for us. Did a super job. It is good to be with family, to focus on the Lord and to come together with him. We need the other PowerPoint up there. So we'll just wait for the other PowerPoint. We won't wait. We'll talk. We'll get going. We have been talking about, I've been sharing with you the 4 words that the elders, deacons, ministry leaders got together and planned as we look at this church about who God wants us to be. We've identified 4 core values that we want to assimilate into everything that we do. As we look at ourselves and we ask, what kind of people are we? We're asking this question, do we do these things? Are these part of our lives? And if not, how can I make sure that I do it? The core values that we've identified were these: caring, daring, preparing, sharing. And there are taglines that go with each of these to describe what they are. We talked about the first one, caring. Caring for others and meeting them where they are. Caring enough for people to accept them where they are in their station of life, where they've come from, not disregarding where they've come from, but to accept each other with all of our differences, with all of our, sometimes those differences get in the way. We want everybody to be the same. We want everybody to be redundant. And it's hard sometimes when we're not, to accept people right where they are. But that's what Jesus did with us, wasn't it? He takes us right where we're at. He doesn't let us stay there. He wants us to grow, but he loves us first, right where we're at, and he takes us there. We talked about daring. Daring to really walk by faith. Daring is a scary thing. It's meaning bold. It's adventuresome. It is getting out and doing things that other people are afraid to do. And this idea of walking by faith is not easy. Number 1, we need to accept by faith what God says about us. Jason said this morning, he shared with us this idea. It is completely inconceivable that God would love us so much to call us his children, to make us his children. That doesn't make any sense in our minds because we know ourselves. And so it's hard sometimes for us to accept the fact that we, when we're in Christ, are pure and blameless in his sight. It's hard for us to accept sometimes that he's got a chair in heaven with our name already on it. And yet that's what he promises. And so I need to accept that by faith. But there's more to walking by faith. Walking by faith means trusting God enough to do what he says. To obey him when he says to do this or do that, to actually do it. We talk about love and forgiveness. We like the idea of love. We don't always like the idea of forgiveness. We like to be forgiven, but sometimes it's hard to forgive. We like the idea of religion and church growing and so forth, but sometimes we're unwilling to do the things that make it happen. Sometimes God calls us, and it's hard for us to go because we don't feel comfortable there. Jason, thanks for answering the call. The call was not just Danny calling you. It's God calling and saying, here's an opportunity to serve. Will you step up to this? And we say, by faith, yes, I'll go where you lead. I'll take the opportunity. I may not be completely ready for it, but I trust that you'll take my little work, my little contribution, my weakness, and turn it into strength and multiply that. And so we've talked about caring for others and meeting them where they are, daring to walk by faith. I want to share with you today this idea of preparing for whatever God calls us to. Preparing for whatever God calls us to. You say, well, Doug, what is that? What's he going to call me to? I don't know. I have no idea what he's going to call you to. I know what he's already called us to, but I don't know what he's got in the future for us. But I need to be prepared. Being a Boy Scout, that was the motto. Be prepared. You say your oath, and then the motto, be prepared. Prepared for what? And the answer was, anything that comes along. Well, wow, how do you do that? You watch Batman, you've watched Batman today. He's a different Batman than I grew up with. The Batman I grew up with, he had the utility belt. You remember that? And it didn't matter where he was. He had some sort of gadget in his utility belt. He'd pull this out, and it was something that would save the world or get him out of a tight jam. But he was always prepared with something. And God calls us to be prepared, to be a tool in his hand, to be useful in his hand. But it takes preparation. But we don't always know what to prepare for. And so how do we prepare? And what do we prepare for? My son, I talked to him yesterday. He's going camping next week. Up in the mountains, up over 10,000 feet. I said, you know there's going to be snow up there. He says, yeah, that's what I'm afraid of. He said, I asked him, well, what are you taking? He says, well, I'm taking everything because I don't want to die. So he's preparing, trying to cover any conceivable situation. He's afraid that his pack is going to be too heavy to carry, though, but that's another worry. But he's trying to prepare. We try to prepare for the things that may come our way. Sometimes we don't even know what those are. Sometimes we're surprised. I spent hours and hours sitting out in the cold watching my father keep our family cars running. And I don't know why, but in Colorado, the cars always seem to break down in the winter. And so we'd sit out in the snow on the ice, and my job was to sit there and watch my father and hand him, I was the gopher. Get me a wrench. What kind of wrench? 5/16. What's 5/16? I didn't know. Get me a 3/4. Oh, I figured that one out. But I watched him, and it prepared me for the time that I had a whole load of teenagers in a van out in the middle of the desert. It was about 120 degrees. We got some bad gas, and the van stopped. The carburetor was flowing gas everywhere over the engine. And I was able, with a pocket knife and a dime, to take the carburetor apart, fix it, and get us back on the road before anybody died of heat stroke. Because I'd been watching my father. But I tell you what, I was not prepared that time on that trip. I was fortunate God blessed us. I had a dime and a pocket knife. But you can bet, any trip I took out for that, I take a bag of tools with me. Real tools. To be prepared, because I don't know what's going to happen. Jesus told a story about a wedding. There was a wedding party that was going on. And with the wedding parties there, it took all week for people to celebrate this wedding. And at one point, the bridegroom is going to come to the special house and be welcomed and honored. And there are a procession of young women who stand outside with lamps getting ready to welcome the bridegroom and honor him. Jesus tells a story about 10 of these young women who went to this house. 5 of them were wise, 5 of them were foolish. Because the 5 wise ones came prepared with extra oil for their lamps. The 5 foolish girls came without any extra oil. Guess what? There was a delay. Surprise, surprise, things happen. The bridegroom was slow in coming. The 5 foolish girls, they ran out of oil. And then they had to run and buy more. But while they were gone buying more, the bridegroom came, entered the house, and closed the door. And what Jesus says, he says, later the other versions also came saying, Lord, Lord, open up for us. They went and bought their oil. They came back and they found the door locked. And he answered, truly I say to you, I do not know you. And Jesus says, be on the alert then, because you don't know the day or the hour. You don't know what God's going to do. You don't know what he's going to call you to. You don't know when he's going to come again. We don't know. We think we know that we've got tomorrow, don't we? We think tomorrow's going to come. But we are not guaranteed of that. Just because it's been coming for the past several millennia doesn't mean it's going to come tomorrow. And if it does come tomorrow, it doesn't mean we're going to see it tomorrow. And just if it does come tomorrow and we do see it, we don't know what God's going to put in our path. And so we need to be preparing for whatever God puts in our path. Well, Doug, that's a lot of stuff. Yes, it is. It absolutely is. But we need to be prepared. Anybody watch the Olympics? You notice at the beginning of the Olympics, there was a lot of news about North Korea joining the Olympics. And a lot of attention was focused on them, but it got real quiet as the Olympics progressed. Because you know how many gold medals the North Koreans won? 0. Not only 0, but they didn't even come close to placing for a bronze. They were way down in the listings because they were unprepared. It was only just a few months ago that they decided they were going to come to the games at all, and they threw a team together. Most of their team were cheerleaders to cheer on the competing Olympians. But those Olympians were not prepared to compete on a world stage. A lot of them were afraid to go back home because a few years ago when the World Cup team did not win the World Cup race, they were sent to a prison camp where they still are. And so they were afraid to go home. But they were sent out unprepared. It wasn't their fault. They didn't know they were even going until the last minute. But it was somebody's fault that they didn't prepare them. And I want to be prepared when God calls me to something, don't you? I don't want to be found trying to play catch up at the last second as I'm standing before God or presented with an opportunity. And so I need to be preparing. Preparing for what, Doug? Let's start with the easy things. How about preparing to lead your family in a walk with Christ? How about preparing to lead your children in a walk with Christ? How about preparing to lead your grandchildren in a walk with Christ? How about God puts a mission in front of you and says, do you see these children? Do you see these grandchildren? Do you see these great grandchildren? What are you feeding into their life? What are you prepared to give them? What are you prepared to speak and to act into their lives? Are you prepared to give them God's word? If not, get prepared to do that because God is calling us to that mission. What about treating your husband and your wife? Are you prepared to lead them in the walk with Christ? Are you prepared to lead them closer to God? Prepare to lead your mate closer to God because God has called us to that task. We talked a little bit last week about purity and impurity. In preparing to meet the onslaught of impurity in this world today, I need to prepare my heart, my head, my thinking, my surrounding, the things that, all of the stuff around me, I need to prepare it to deal with the impurity of the world. And Jesus calls us to stay unspotted from the world, to stand out pure, to hold on to holiness, to be his righteous people. I can't do that by accident. It doesn't happen in this world, does it? We are inundated from every side by impurity of all kinds, and God calls us to holiness. What are you doing to ensure holiness in your life? Are you preparing for it, or are you just letting it come? Just hoping that you'll stand when the time comes, and the time always comes. Preparing for what? To lead our families, to speak to your neighbor, to speak to a coworker, to speak to a classmate at school about God, about Christ and what he means to you. Peter said, be prepared to give an answer for the faith that you have. Be prepared to give an answer for the hope that you have. Get ready, because it's going to come, and God's going to open up a situation for you. Call you to stand and speak his name. Are you prepared to do that? Oh man, Doug, that's a scary time, because you never know what's going to happen. No, you don't. And we know what's happened. Even people who were prepared to speak were persecuted. The prophets who prepared and spoke the word that God gave them to speak, they were all killed. Am I prepared to walk that road? Talking about daring. Daring to prepare, and then daring to deliver, to act by faith, but prepare for whatever God calls me to. He may call me to speak to my neighbor. I pray that he does. He may call me to do something at church. He might call me to lead a small group. He might call me, and I know guys who've done this, they started small group Bible studies at work. And they have touched a whole company. They have made a difference because they stood, because they were prepared to answer the call. Not because they were so accomplished, not because they were so wise, not because they were better than anybody else, but because they were prepared to answer God's call and let God provide the strength. But they had already engaged in God. They had already engaged in his word. They had already prepared for the moment that God called them so that they could say yes. God has called every one of us. We need to be prepared for the times that he calls us for new things. Maybe it's calling to respond to criticism. When people criticize you, when people say things about you, especially when they're not true, how do you respond? Are you prepared to respond in a godly way? Well, how do you get prepared to respond that way? Because when somebody says something bad about you, when somebody does something bad to you, when somebody hurts you and they hurt your relationships, what do? How do you act like Jesus? You don't do it by our own natural ways, our own natural feelings, do we? By our own natural feelings, we fire back. Somebody hurts me, my natural inclination is to hurt them worse. And then the law of the Old West is to do unto them before they do unto you. And so you try to get them first because you know something's coming. That's not godly, is it? And so I need to be prepared for what God is going to call me to. God calls me to give. Am I prepared to give? Jason was sharing with us that this has been God's plan for his people to give. And what God says is you need to give the whole tithe to me so my storerooms can be full. How honoring is it to God when the church has to scrimp and pinch pennies to get by? Does that honor God? We want to honor God, but sometimes we are slaves to debt and we haven't prepared to be able to give. And we're supporting MasterCard and Visa instead of supporting God and his work. Maybe we need to prepare by setting ourselves free from the debt, getting out of that so we can be free to give when God calls us to give. He's called us to make disciples already. Are we prepared to do that? We want to follow this value, this core value of being people who are constantly preparing for whatever God may call us to, because He does call us. How do we prepare? First of all, you just be faithful in the small things. There are things that we know God has called us to. He's called us to make disciples. He's called us to love each other. He's called us to forgive each other. He's called us to be like Him. Can we do that? That's not a rhetorical question. Can we do that? Are you prepared to do that? I hear a few yeses, and I'm not sure how to interpret that. Because honestly, if you're not prepared to do that, don't say yes. But look inside yourself. Am I preparing to respond to people that I don't necessarily like? Do I respond to them in love? Can I love a Republican? Can I love a Democrat? You know, sometimes stupid things like politics divide us. We've got a bigger picture that we're dealing with. We're dealing with the God of all creation. And He's called us to unity in love. And He says, here's how people will know you're my disciples, by the way you love each other. Are you prepared to do that? Because that means stepping back, dying to yourself, putting your will last, and the needs of others first. That's the way Paul describes it in Philippians 2. He says, have the same attitude as Christ, who counted the needs of others more important than his own. And so He humbled Himself. He emptied Himself. He poured Himself out for our sake. He says, that's the Spirit. Are you prepared to do that, to humble yourself and put your needs last? We start thinking, well, you know, that's a great idea, Doug, but you know, you got to, and we start making excuses. You got to take care of things. You got to watch out, because if you gave everything away, well, you wouldn't have anything left, right? Right? Are you prepared to do that? And we talk about wealth and money, and we talk about the fact that, you know, there's nothing wrong with it as long as we're prepared, as long as we're willing to give it away. And I said, that's right. When's the last time you did that? Well, I don't know. I'm not going to do that, but I'm willing to. If God were to come here and ask me to my face, Doug, would you do this? Would you give up your house and your car? Would you give everything away? Of course, I'd say, just a minute, let me think about it, Lord. Just a minute. But what about really looking at my life? Saying, am I really willing to give of myself? To put myself last? I need to be faithful in the small things. That's a small thing. And when I'm faithful in the small things, He gives us more. Jesus tells a story about a master who was going on a journey, and he gave to his servants all of his possessions. He gave a certain amount of money to one servant, a certain amount of money to another, a certain amount of money to another. The first two, they went and invested that money. They doubled their money. The third one didn't do anything with it. He hid it in the ground. The master came back. The first two servants came to him and said, look what we did with your money. We doubled it. And he said, you have been faithful in small things. Now I know I can trust you with big things. Now I will give you big things. Welcome into my kingdom. Because they prepared. They did the things, the small things that God asked them to do. God said, I will open up and I'll trust you with grand things. I don't know what God's got in store for us. I know He says some crazy things like, we will judge angels. What does that mean? I don't even know. God's got something huge in store for us. Can we even take care of the little things here? Only by preparation, only by thinking, only by imagining, only by being careful. And sometimes we don't like to think about things. It was Thomas Edison who said this. He said, "There is no expedient to which a man will not resort to avoid the real labor of thinking." In a nutshell, he says, people will avoid the real hard work of thinking about things, and they'll just buzz through life oblivious to what's really going on around us. Sometimes we do that with God. Instead of preparing and changing our minds, instead of reading the Word with all the intent and seriousness to hear what He has to say, we read it based on our past knowledge. We put on our past knowledge glasses and say, I'm going to read it this way, and I'll interpret it this way, because that's the way a preacher told me when I was 4. And so I'm going to believe it that way. And God forbid somebody tell me anything different. And we fail to grow. We fail to prepare for what bigger thing God might have to give us, because we get real comfortable in our knowledge or lack of knowledge. God calls us to prepare. So we do the little things. We read the Bible. We read the Bible at home, not just in Bible class. But we attend Bible class. Some of you might just have something real important to do today after its worship service. But I don't know things too much more important than studying the Bible, and we have Bible classes. Free. You don't have to pay for it. We've got teachers who have studied and prepared to open up the Word, to search the deep things that God is laying for us to help us prepare. He calls us to prepare. Do the little things. Get involved in a house-to-house group. Be ready to learn something new and really think. He says this, be prepared to give an answer. I need to think, and I need to process, and I need to prepare so I have an answer when somebody says, why do you believe in God? And that's what the world's asking us today. They say, you fools. And I need to be prepared to give an answer. I need to prepare to build by building and mending relationships. There are people that I need to talk to. I need to mend relationships, whether with a mate, with children, with people in the church, with people at work. Relationships that I need to mend, which prepares the ground so I can speak into their lives the presence of God. If I'm holding grudges against people, it's really hard to speak presence of God into their lives, isn't it? If I'm living in an impure relationship with somebody, it's really hard to lead them to Christ. I need to prepare, and I need to pray, because I can't do this on my own. God is the source of our strength. I just want to take just a moment and invite you every other Friday night. There are a group of us that meet just to pray. We met last Friday night, so we won't meet this Friday night, but we will the next Friday. Every other Friday night, a group of us are meeting to pray for this church, to pray for you, to pray for God's will in the lives of individuals, to pray for this country. We are praying. We're just spending the time seeking God's face. And we invite you to join us. If you think it's important to seek God's face and His will, join us every other Friday night. Not this Friday, next Friday. We want to prepare for what God is calling us to. So we practice looking through the eyes of Jesus. We practice looking at people through the eyes of Jesus. Jesus said, here are the people that are going to go to heaven. Here are the people that are going to go to hell. This is Matthew 25. He says to these people that are going to go to heaven, says, welcome into my Father's home. And they say, well, why us? And he says, because when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick, you visited me. When I was in prison, you came to me. You did these things for me. And they say, when did we ever see you sick or naked or in prison? When did we ever see you there? They said, inasmuch as you did it for the least of these, you did it for me. We prepare to stand before Jesus by doing the things that Jesus did, by valuing the things that he valued. And so we prepare for whatever God calls us to, but here's the one thing we know he's calling us to. He's calling us to stand before him someday. We've lost a lot of people this past year. A lot of people who've been precious to us have died. And it just affirms to us that this life is short and every one of us die. And Jesus said, Paul said, he said, every knee will bow before Jesus. Every knee will see him. Every knee will confess that he is Lord. Every voice, every tongue will confess. We will. That is in our future. There is no escaping that. And we will meet that with joy or we will meet it with fear. One or the other. There's no other way out. But we prepare in this life to stand before him with joy. How many of you dream in color? Do you dream in color? They say we dream in black and white, but I know there's one dream I had. I only remember 2 dreams out of my whole life. But I remember this one, and it was in brilliant color, and it was the second coming. I remember the clouds opening up, and there was orange and red and white and blue, and Jesus stepped through the clouds. It was a brilliant, vivid dream. But what I remember about it was a joy that I had in my heart. Going, yes, he's coming back. I want to be prepared to stand before him with that same joy that I had in my dream. But I don't do that by accident. I do that by preparing today. And so, we are calling ourselves to be people who are caring for others and meeting them where they are, daring to really walk by faith, and preparing all the time for whatever God calls us to. And God is calling us to his side. I don't know where you're at today, but I know this. You one day will stand before God. And you'll have to give an answer to him. This world cannot happen by accident. There is a designer who made this world, and we will stand before him. Are you prepared for that day? If not, here's what God has done to help you get prepared. He sent his son to pay the price for your sins. He says the wages of sin is death. You sin, you will die. You'll be separated from God. So, to adopt you as my children and to take you to my home, I will pay the price for your sin. I'll let my son live a perfect life and let him die in your place on the cross so that your sin can be taken away. All you have to do is put your faith in him. Trust in him with all of your heart, enough to walk by faith, enough to prepare to meet him, enough to prepare for the calling that he's going to call you to, enough to love the people who are around us like he did, to walk like him. He says, put your faith in me, die to yourself, be immersed, baptized into me, filled with my spirit so you can walk according to my power so that I can be glorified through you and you can live with me in heaven. Not just heaven, but on this earth with his presence. God has given us a great gift, one that we don't deserve, but he has called us worthy to accept it. So the invitation is to prepare to meet him. The invitation is to take the step to say, I'm ready to give my life to Christ because I don't want to stand before him unprepared. So we're going to sing a song. If you need to pray about things, if there are things in your life, our elders are standing in the back and they're ready to seek God's face with you. Go meet with them. But if you're ready to give your life to Christ today, come down here while we stand and while we sing this song.